Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project with EC Sinkowski. My name is Patrick Cummings, and every episode I have the privilege of having a discussion with EC on subject matters that range from nutrition to fitness to the choices we can all make to live a healthier, more functional life. By exploring both the principles at play and the actions worth carrying out as a result, it's our goal to get you thinking, get you moving, and get you taking more consistent steps toward optimizing your well-being. Thank you as always for tuning into the show. How are you, EC?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. We are returning to our hotcakes format, which is, I think, probably the most fun for me because I get to tell you what we're going to talk about instead of the other way around.
That's right.
Which is what it usually goes. But so hotcakes is for folks who haven't dived into one of them yet. Hotcakes is when I send you about a day in advance of our recording. I send you 3 articles, 3 things I've found on the internet recently that made me curious and made me interested in what your thoughts are on them. And then I just, again, I send them to you the day before. You have a little bit of a chance to look at it and dive in and formulate some thoughts, but not too much time. And then we just kind of spend a little bit of time unpacking them and seeing where the conversation goes. Cool?
Definitely.
All right. And so as always say before these, the point of these isn't to poo-poo on anybody or anything in particular. They're just mostly a fodder for conversation and to see where your head's at on some of these things that sometimes make me scratch my head because I'm really confused, or sometimes I think, well, that's really interesting and I'd love to know EC's thought. And sometimes it's just like, this feels very absurd to me and I would love for EC to tell me why it's absurd. So,
right.
All right. So we've got 3. We've got, let me do a quick, we've got something on slowing the aging process. We've got something on reversing aging, and we've got another on how to deal with stress eating, which we've done a whole episode on, but this particular little article added a little bit of a thing. So I wanted to bring them to you. Okay. But this first one is an article called "Want to Slow the Aging Process? It may be as simple as eating less." I'm just going to do a quick review of what's in this, a very short article. But it says a 2-year study of 128 middle-aged people who cut back on calories by 25% found that their bodies aged more slowly as a result. The effects were, quote unquote, similar to the effect of a smoking cessation intervention. In other words, as effective as if somebody was smoking and then stopped, which is in and of itself pretty impressive. The study, run by the U.S. National Institute of Aging, tracked how quickly the subjects' bodies were aging by studying changes in the DNA of the participants, and especially chemical tags called methylation marks. Thank you. Extracted from white blood cells. DNA methylation marks, quote unquote, regulate the expression of genes and are known to change with aging. And then the last bit that I'll read is just that the latest study adds to the research, suggesting a link between cutting back on calories and living longer, a link that's already been found to exist in multiple other species. And so I've got some specific questions, but just quick hotcake thoughts on this idea and this particular article.
Yeah. With these hotcakes, I do take a look at the study, but it's a relatively brief look, so I don't have a chance to, make sure everything's valid and understand all aspects what they analyze. So I do want to say that in case I'm getting some things wrong. But kind of reading the mainstream article and then briefly looking at the study, sometimes I think there might be, again, something a little bit lost in translation in the qualitative terms of like eating less. It's always like, okay, well, how much less and what kind of number of calories are we talking about? Now, they talk about a 25% caloric restriction, but it's like, and they do mention that these individuals are not obese, but they don't necessarily say that these people don't have weight to lose. And so sometimes I think when we read an article about caloric restriction, our mind immediately goes to like severe caloric restriction, like maybe 50% of calories of what we need or something like this that we've heard in like mouse or fly studies, when in reality, maybe this caloric restriction is just having them cut back so where they're now going to be achieving a healthy weight. And so again, I think that this might just be like controlling quantity in a very normal way versus like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be gnawing hungry every day and like whittle away as though I'm starving to increase my longevity,
Mm-hmm. So just so I understand, is what you're saying, or is part of what you're saying is, it says this 25% decrease. But it doesn't give you a baseline of, well, if those folks were maybe already at 25% over where perhaps they should be, then the 25% isn't magic. It's just simply the, as we talked about before, the necessary caloric deficit that they need to then trigger all
Yeah,
the things that the thing is triggering.
totally. And maybe they're only looking to lose 15, 20 pounds, right? That could make it, still within a healthy range. There's a wide range of what can be healthy, right? But maybe now they're just eating 25% less. And so now they're going to lose 10, 15 pounds or something like that. And so sometimes I think when we hear caloric restriction and longevity, we immediately go to these like super, super extreme ideas in our mind. It's like, maybe they're just tightening up the diet in a really reasonable way. In my masterclass, again, it's happened with this group too. People will be shocked to learn that they're eating 2,500 calories or more. They're like, oh my gosh, I thought I was closer to 1,200 or 1,600. And then they find out they're eating 2,000 or 2,500. And so sometimes a caloric restriction in my class to drive weight loss is like 2,000. Yep. And so again, I think sometimes when people hear just caloric restriction, the first thought is like, oh my gosh, I'm not eating anything, right?
It is a common, or at least it seems to be, and we've talked about fasting before, but it does seem to be a very common, almost assumption at this point that fasting is linked strongly to longevity, let's say. Thoughts on that? You mentioned like mice and fly studies and non-human studies. Why is it that those two things are being linked so strongly at this point? If like you just said, it might not be magic here, it might just simply be bringing people to the place where they should be otherwise.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there definitely are studies that do look at extreme caloric restriction in mice and flies, I believe. And I think we talked about this briefly in the fasting episode we did, kind of about health and longevity. And it's like one of the things that we really have to remember about these animal models is getting a mouse to live longer in a germ-free cage is not the same as getting a human to live longer in like a free living environment. And so we're going to be exposed to a lot of stressors, both from an immune perspective, as well as like even a structural perspective, like bone density, that we really have to be careful that when we look at things like caloric restriction, are we getting enough of the right nutrients? That we're not just cutting back on calories and eating, 1,000 or 1,200 calories a day. And now we're also missing out on calcium or, magnesium or something like that are really, really important. Now, this article does specify that the caloric restriction was reducing calories while keeping all of the essential nutrients there. And so again, I'm like, is this just a mild diet? Like, are we really? Yes, we're caloric restricting relative to where they are. But most people, just based on the statistics that over 70% of people in the US are overweight or obese, it's like, yes, maybe we're just restricting calories back to now there's some natural weight loss that would occur outside of a modern food environment, or what we would look like before all of the processed stuff, right?
Maybe it's this. That seems obvious to me, but only because I get to talk to you every week about roughly this exact subject. But why isn't like it? I know this article is just a blurb of a study, et cetera, but why isn't that like an obvious, hey, that could also be this, right? Every time we see something like this, it's like, maybe scientists found the magic bullet. It could be fasting, but there's right. And 25% blah, blah, blah. Right. But there's never any mention of that, the thing that you just said, right? The obvious answer, not let's go straight to the DNA and see if we can identify through however they do that, what's actually happening. Why isn't the obvious answer the first answer?
Some of it, I think, is the article. I'd be surprised if the researchers in their article don't say something like, a limitation of this study is we don't know if this would just be achieved with normal diet, or whatever it might be. Typically, once you get into the limitations section of these research articles, they are pretty straightforward of like, hey, we haven't really proven anything here. But then once we go to the mainstream and like, how do you make this interesting and how do you make this something that people want to click on? It's going to have to take an angle just to sort of say something like, we discovered something that might be like what we already know, isn't going to do it. So, and now I also think there does need to be that mechanistic work of looking at like the DNA methylation tags to understand the process by which caloric restriction is effective from a health perspective. And is there things that we can do to manipulate that? But then the question is, in application, is this any different than just eating at the adequate number of calories versus probably a slight excess, which a lot of us are in,
This is going to feed a little bit into actually, this whole thing will feed a little bit into our next topic, but so maybe I'll use this as a bridge, but it reminds me of something we've talked about before, which is this idea that science, and you're going to have to put this in the right words, but science it's not often the case that, like, cutting edge science is telling us something perhaps that we didn't know, but it's perhaps what it's often doing is saying that thing that you already knew is true based on life and experience. And now we're starting to understand why that thing is true, right? So why
exactly
caloric deficit is that kind of what you're saying here is like the DNA test might teach us why the slight caloric deficit is doing the thing that it's doing. It's not really giving us anything new to act on.
Yeah, I think so. I think we see things occur observationally first, and then we use science to explain the observation. Smoking is a good example. Like, why do all of these smokers now have lung cancer? Okay, let's go through the mechanisms and figure out why that occurred, right? And so science is typically lagging behind observation. And you can even think about it in like medicine and treatments. They might discover a treatment, and then it's like, okay, let's figure out why that works and if it'll work for other people. Yeah, so observation typically precedes science.
Love that. Okay, so that does feed nicely into our second of our three hotcakes, which is related to reversing the aging process. Which
yes.
And so I'm going to do a quick there. So this is from another mainstream news article. It's much longer. I'm not going to read too much into it. I'm actually going to just do some quick bullet points, which is there's and I don't think there's anything wrong with using his name because he's clearly been out there. This actually went viral, which is how I stumbled upon it. But there's an entrepreneur. His last name is Johnson. I forgot his first name off the top of my head. He's 45 years old, and he's aiming to make his body 18 years old again. And it costs him about $2 million a year and a team of doctors. He's an ultra wealthy software entrepreneur. And he's on track to spend at least $2 million this year on his body. He wants to have the brain, heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, tendons, teeth, skin, hair, bladder, penis, and rectum of an 18-year-old. And this will be the last bit I read. The whole article is actually, I think, is really interesting. But Johnson and his team are more than a year into their experiments, which they collectively call the Project Blueprint. This includes strict guidelines for Johnson's diet, 1,977 vegan calories a day, exercise an hour a day, high intensity 3 times a week, and sleep at the same time every night after 2 hours of wearing glasses that block blue light. And there's, again, lots more in here. The longer article breaks down even more detail as to what he's doing. But I think that gives enough to get a sense of like what's going on here. So first, just high level, had you come across this? And if so, what were your kind of initial thoughts?
Yeah, somebody who's taken my masterclass before actually forwarded me the article, and they're like, I think this might be the worried well.
Cool. Let's break that down a little bit because I'd love to know.
Yeah. I mean, okay, the first thing I want to say is, I did read the article, pretty much the full thing, and I'm not against what this guy's doing in the sense he's got the money, he's got the time, he wants to do it. Like, go ahead. Like, I'm not here to criticize that he wants to go ahead and do this. Like, again, he's got the resources to do it. I think he sold his company for $800 million. So go ahead, do your thing. Yep. So I'm not criticizing him and his project and whatever. But, I had kind of like 3 different thoughts when I was looking at it. The first one was, what would have happened to your aging process if we just did what we preach about all the time here? Because what we learn in the article is by the time he sold his business for $800 million, he was overworked, obviously, to get to that point to make it successful. He, believe, was severely overweight and depressed. And so now he's making all of these really radical changes of analyzing every last thing and taking every supplement and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, what if we just did like 800 grams of fruits and vegetables, adequate protein, cut back on the processed stuff, exercise regularly, got some sleep? How far would those basics get us in terms of reducing or reversing the aging process? It's like, what about that first step? Why did we have to jump all the way to the final ultimate idea of this? So I think that might get lost a little bit because I think there would be some really positive responses from doing some really basic things that maybe we don't have to spend $2 million a year. But again, not against him, but it's just kind of a thought of mine. It's like, well, what would have happened if we just did the basics? But anyway, that's the first thought. The second one that I thought is sort of ironic is they talk about how much time all of this stuff takes, from the tests and then the procedures, from skincare to like, I don't even know what else, organ, workups and all this stuff, that they mention it's like a full-time job. So here we have someone who's like trying to reverse the aging clock, I suspect because they want to live longer. But are we just trying to live longer so that we can practice more anti-aging regimes? Like, if it's an entire day of like doing all of this stuff, like when is the living happening, right? It's sort of a funny paradigm that this becomes a full-time job. So what are we really living for? So that was interesting. But then I think the kicker for me is, okay, so let's say this works. Let's just assume, because I think the idea is like he's going to, maybe at 45 years old, all of his organs are going to look like he's 35 or something like that, was one of the lines in there, right? So let's just say that he achieves that. The real problem here is, if anybody wants to do this themselves, they have to replicate all of it, because we don't know which of the treatments, which of the supplements is doing anything, because he's doing so many different things. So for example, we could be like, oh, look at his liver improvement. You could be like, oh, that's because of the liver supplements. Like, no. It could be the diet change. It could be the exercise change. It could be a whole bunch of other reasons, stress reduction or something like that. Yep. And so now if anybody wants to do this, they have to do the whole kit and caboodle. We can't just pick the one supplement, or we're like, oh, I'm going to change my exercise or something like that and see what happens. They have to become this person who's living and breathing every last aspect of this. So I just sort of think, okay, again, N of one, do your thing, have fun. But I think the utility for other people, even if something is proven, just has such little application, because we're not going to replicate all of this across everybody.
The maybe taking each one of those things and unpacking them a little bit is the first thing you said, which is like, what would happen if we just did the basics really well, really consistently? Is that it? What pops in my head, or what popped in my head immediately, was the phrase, I don't remember if it was yours or if you borrowed it from Kelly Starrett, of majoring in the minors, right? Like, is this just like the most in your mind, like the most extreme example of somebody who's majoring in the minors?
Yeah, I think so. Although, hey, prove me wrong. But like, again, I'm always like, let's see how far the basics get us. And again, we know people aren't doing the basics on average, and we're already living to mid 70s without the basics. So sometimes I'm like, I don't know, let's do the basics really well, and maybe we get to 95, right? Or something like that. So I don't know, maybe the minors will help and more work can be done there. But I think the first step for all of us is to do the basics first and see how far that gets us.
What's interesting, there was a little short kind of interview. I don't know if you watched it. It's like a 5-minute interview in that article. And it was on like a news show. And the anchor asked like, okay, well, most people aren't going to do this. So like, give us basically it was like, give us what we can do. And his answer was, well, like, get more sleep, eat more fruits and vegetables. And I think there may have been like, lower your stress levels. There was like a third one that was also
exercise.
And he's like, if you get there, yeah, exactly. And if you do that, you'll be, light years ahead, which kind of just speaks to your point.
Totally. 100%.
Yeah.
And he probably knows this. And again, he's got the resources and time to do it. So knock yourself out. But it's just sort of, I can see people getting attracted to some of it, like, oh, well, what supplements are you using, right? Or, oh, what sort of like cream are you using on your face or something like that? And it's like, okay, well, that's not going to do it. You've got to, if you want his results, you got to do all of it right now, because none of it's proven.
Okay, so the second thing was your question about like, well, if you're now just living to go to wake up every day to take your supplements, exactly, go to 3 appointments, get the 7 skincare treatments, right? And in the end of the article, the author made the point of saying like, he went to go visit this guy and he had just gone through some kind of treatment and his face looked like he had been stung by 100 bees, right? And exactly. So and that was just like, yeah, that's kind of, sometimes that just happens, right? In this pursuit, that's just going to happen sometimes. And so to me, again, what's interesting in there is something we've talked about before, which is thinking about whatever decisions, whatever things we're going to try, whatever protocols we want to follow, always keeping in mind, like, well, what the heck is the point of all of this? Is it like, why? We're not doing this just to do this, or at least we shouldn't fall into the trap of doing this just because we're supposed to do it because somebody said we should do it, or because theoretically it could improve my life in some way. But instead saying, let's get specific about like why the cold plunge, right? Why fill in the blank, right? Why HRV training? Why anything? what are you trying to improve? Because it's not that. As soon as you start
Right.
to try to improve that thing, you've lost the script. And to me, that's what popped in my head reading this and chatting is just like, he's going to get really good at studying his body,
Yeah.
at accumulating metrics. But to what end, to your point?
Well, and he's pretty clear in the article that he's fine with devoting his body to science. So for his end, it is collecting the metrics, and that's fine. Again, do you? But I think for a lot of people, the idea of longevity is because you want to be around longer to enjoy your life. Well, it's like, okay, well, let's make sure we're enjoying the time now. Like we're not just saving up to like have a really, awesome 80 to 100 years old, hopefully like we're enjoying the time up until 82. So I think it does give us good pause to think about like, okay, why am I really doing this? And is there something that I'm getting out of it that's truly I'm after versus just the metric?
Okay. Last question on this is a little bit what we talked about a few minutes ago, but I'd love to know just your general thoughts on like cutting edge science, right? Because that's what all this is, right? That he's got a team of doctors. They're running off thousands of tests, every year. They're measuring things that nobody else measures. Where in your mind, like where does that fit into the grand scheme of things? When folks are reporting, okay, there was a study of 100 people and they found that, this thing might be happening. And then all of a sudden everybody's doing the thing, right? Everybody's like, well, that's indication of something. And I now have to do that thing or take that supplement or whatever. Where is the value to you in the quote unquote cutting edge science, knowing that cutting edge science is still being figured out, still being interpreted, and generally done in what has to be relatively limited settings, right?
Yes.
How closely do you pay attention to that stuff, the stuff that's on what we might consider the cutting edge?
I don't because I think to me it goes into that whole worried well thing. I mean, I think from what I can tell from the article, it's just an article. I think he's in a proper headspace about this if he truly is like, no, I just want to see the data and it's worth it to me. But I think a lot of people take this as like, I need to do these things because I might get one more day or I might get, 1% better on health, whatever that might be, or something like that. So I think it can really wear on people's anxiety. I think that we've talked about a lot. I don't really follow it at all because so many studies show promise and then they fall apart. And I think I think there's a lot of researchers and doctors out there that are on the cutting edge of trying to find new things, and they are testing it when it's useful. I think cancer therapies are probably the greatest example. There's tons of clinical trials that people try to get into because that is the last resort. I think that type of cutting edge stuff is like phenomenal, but you're going to have to find the doctor who's been studying it for their whole life. Like you're not going to find that by reading some pop science, magazine online or something like that. So yeah, I think a lot of kind of this kind of cutting edge stuff that's in the wellness space is a lot of unproven stuff. And again, trends on people's anxiety, I think more so than like, oh, this is interesting. I just really want to collect biomarkers like it sounds like this guy is.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. All right. Let's go to our third of three hotcakes. And again, I managed to get through this without none of these are things I found on Instagram. So this is just another article. It's called Stress Eating. Here's how to train your brain to crave healthy food. So we did a whole episode on stress eating, which you can obviously recap for us real quick. I'm just going to do a couple highlights from this article, including the bit at the end that I thought just kind of perked up. While we can't eliminate every major source of stress in our lives, we can control to some extent the impact it has on our bodies. Scientists have found that there are ways to alleviate stress and retrain your brain to improve your diet and prevent stress-induced weight gain. Our bodies evolved to secrete the stress hormone cortisol when our brains sense danger. Cortisol elevates our heart rate, blood pressure, and blood sugar levels. In the short term, cortisol protects you from immediate threats by sending your body into fight or flight mode. But when your job, finances, and other circumstances ratchet up your stress levels on a regular basis, it leads to chronic cortisol elevation. And then the bit at the end is where we can't always reduce the stress in our lives, you can retrain your brain to want better foods when you're stress eating. So this is kind of the part that perked up. In a study published last year, scientists recruited 100 adults with elevated stress levels and split them into two groups. Everyone was trained to do a daily 6-minute stress reduction exercise called progressive muscle relaxation, which involves tensing and relaxing your muscles from toes to head. This deep relaxation technique has been shown in studies to reduce stress and anxiety. Members of one group were assigned to eat a serving of fresh fruit, such as sliced pineapple, honeydew, and pears, about 5 minutes into each of their daily progressive muscle relaxation sessions. After a week of this, the researchers found that eating just the fruit alone made the participants feel less stressed and put them in a better mood. By pairing the fruit with a relaxation exercise, their brains began to view the fruit as something that reduced their stress levels, essentially turning the fruit into comfort food. Okay, so that was a lot, but I wanted to just kind of lay the foundation of why I thought this was interesting, which is like this kind of behavioral change. It's sort of like taking what ends up being willpower and turning it into at least some kind of like protocol for like, here's what you do instead of just like grin and bearing it and hope you get through the day. So again, as always, just high level thoughts, reaction to the article or to the idea itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was cool. I mean, first of all, they're promoting fruit, so obviously big win in my call over here. So that was great. I think it's really interesting, too, that they were able to kind of Pavlov train these individuals such that now they eat fruit and they feel relaxed, even without doing the progressive relaxation technique after a certain amount of time. So it does show that, like, we have this kind of conditioning response. So that's really cool. I think we're still going to have the issue of, okay, we trained ourselves to be relaxed with fruit. Very cool. Did we train ourselves to choose fruit? So when the people are stressed, is their initial response going to be to take the fruit over the chocolate bar? That would be the next step, right? Like, yes, we can relax with fruit, but are we going to choose fruit? And I don't know. I don't know that fruit will ever be able to compete with Ben and Jerry's. I don't know. Just because it's never as
mango. Come on now.
I know. Like, I do think it's a great strategy for people. And they mentioned in this article, like, to pick some of these sweeter tropical fruits. And I think that's a great idea. I think people, as a strategy at home, having cut up pineapple, having cut up watermelon, mango, just in the fridge, ready to go. I think it's a great idea because I do think they're satisfying and I do think they're very filling. And you might not want the pineapple ice cream immediately after once you have enough of that. But it's still not going to set off the same response as, chocolate covered pretzels. It's still not going to be as dopamine releasing as ice cream is, or even pizza for that matter, right? So that would kind of be the next step in my mind. Like, is this strong enough to make the behavior change while it's happening in that environment when processed food is around?
How often do you talk to folks, whether in your masterclass or just chatting with people, how often do you talk about these kind of like, I think you use like conditioning response, I think is one of the things you just said, like how, like that's not, 800 grams of fruit and vegetable. That's not weigh and measure. That's not caloric deficit. That's not macros. That's psychological, maybe might be the closest thing that it is. Totally. How often do you find yourself talking to people about that sort of habit loop or psychological conditioning or whatever it might be? And how often is that the real unlock for people, if it is at all, versus a better understanding of, again, calories or et cetera, or those sorts of things?
We probably talk about it a good amount. Whether or not we can crack it is the kicker. I have an individual who, and this actually came up when I did a grad group, which was kind of like a follow-up of a master class last year, and I haven't done it since, but was an individual who has stress eating as kind of the clutch. And I have worked with this individual multiple times, and I just sort of said, do you think some of this is that you identify as a stress eater? Like that's part of your identity is the struggle of stress eating. And they responded yes. And I think that's really true, that we have to catch ourselves of like what we associate with about our behaviors in food, because that might be the reason that we continue to do it. It's like, oh, I'm a stress eater, so when I stress out, I just eat. That's just my response. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe you've done that, but maybe you're somebody who's, when you're stressed, you can figure out a new response, right? And if we can somehow get in there and in between the stimulus and the response, that's where we have some power. I also think there's the psychological issue that I try to crack all the time. I think the perception about what people think they should be eating is one of the biggest limitations in making progress, especially with weight loss. The perception that I think I should be eating 1,500 calories, or the perception that women should eat 1,200 calories or 1,700 calories, or whatever the number is. Oh my goodness. If we can drop whatever your perception or your psychological belief about how many calories are appropriate, we are off to the races. But getting to that part is difficult. So yeah, I think that's a huge influence, a huge influence. And again, I do my best to point it out where I think it's playing a role. And I even talked about this with somebody with migraines. They've associated migraines with a specific pattern in their diet. Migraines are really hard to tease out. There are some dietary influences, but then I also wonder how much of a conditioning we now have that it's like, I now have this belief that when I do this dietary practice or eat this food, I get a migraine. I was like, how much of that is the food and how much of that is the conditioning response? The brain is nuts. So I have no idea. But yeah, these are discussions I try to have. But again, if we can actually crack that conditioning association, that's where the work is.
Love it. All right. Any other last thoughts on either this particular article or the other ones worth popping up, or you want to wrap this thing up?
I think with the stress eating, I know we talked about it in that episode, but I think it's always good to remind people it's like the environment drives a lot of this. And I've always see that with the stress stuff about like how we're busy with our life and our jobs, and we are. But what's happening is we're busy and we're stressed, and now we're surrounded by cookies and chips and all of this stuff. There are plenty of cultures in like developing nations where I can assure you that these individuals are living stressful lives just on like lack of affluence and lack of like real resources in their lives. And they're not just putting on weight independently, right? In some developing nations. And they have plenty of stress, what I would consider much higher stress than we're experiencing on day-to-day levels because of survival. And so I just really like to push back on this notion of like, I'm just stressed and therefore the weight just comes on. Now, stress is affecting your response to that, how you're responding, but it's really that combination of having the food around to then eat that excess calories to put the weight on. It just doesn't happen independently. So I know we've mentioned that before, but I just always have to mention that because I think people think it's some like mystical process is occurring.
Yeah. And I would definitely recommend folks go back and listen to that episode on stress eating, because that was it in 3 minutes, but we talk about that quite a bit more. Okay, cool. Thank you, EC. That was fun. It's always fun for me to do hotcakes. Thank you everybody out there for listening. If you are not yet subscribed or following wherever you are listening or watching to this, please do so you don't miss another episode. And EC and I will be back for another episode of the Consistency Project next week.